In 1842, Tsar Nicholas I made a fateful decision for Russia's railways. All Russian railways would use a 5-foot gauge. This made a huge impact because Russian railways would now be 3 inches wider than all of those of Europe. It was a small technical choice that would quietly set Russia apart from its European neighbors. But the surprising part about this is that this 3 extra inches of rail didn't just shape Russian engineering. It shaped Russian economics, warfare, politics, and global influence. Today we're going to explore how a decision made in the 1840s still ripples through wars today, borders today, and trade routes today, and how the width of Russian train tracks continues to shape Russia's place in the world. In 1842, the Russian Empire began building its network of railways using a 5-foot gauge, which would be slightly wider than the standard gauge of 4 feet and 9 inches. Russia was persuaded by engineer Pavel Melnikov to make them wider because it would create more stability, more capacity, and even higher speeds on Russia's fairly flat terrain. Russia's rail would not connect seamlessly to Western Europe's rail system to ensure that any invaders would not be able to just roll right in. The Russian railroads became a vital source of economic and industrial growth in the late 19th century. The railways linked Russian farmlands to its industrial cities, which funneled grain, coal, and oil to the cities. By 1890, there was over 50,000 kilometers of rail that had been laid within the Russian lands. One railway, the Trans-Siberian Railway that finished in 1904 and spanned over 9,000 kilometers. This rail was built primarily for shipping Siberian resources to the cities, as well as to help migrate more Russians to Siberia. This railway helped knit Russian Europeans and also Asian economic interests together and facilitated trade on a continental scale. This rail went as far as Manchuria, which connected to a Chinese Eastern Railway, which gave Russian economic access into northeast China and gave influence within Asia. Because of the incompatibility with Western Europe railways, this made Russia focus inward and become semi-isolated from the European markets. If Russia wanted to export or import goods, trains entering or exiting Russia would have to stop at the border, where the cargo would then be removed and reloaded onto another European railway wagon, which severely slowed down trade. In 1904, Russia saw the limitations of the Trans-Siberian Railway when Japan invaded Manchuria and Korea. The Trans-Siberian line was single track over most of its length. Trains could only go one way at a time in many sections, causing huge traffic jams and delays. It took time for Russia to fully mobilize on the far east side of its borders, and by the time they arrived, Japan had nearly made entrenchments and were winning the war. Though the Russians had stretched the empire's reach with this railway, it was not able to defend it due to its lack of logistical capacity and therefore had to give up Manchuria and Asia to the Japanese. The loss taught the Russians to double-track this Trans-Siberian Railway in order to create more capacity and make sure there are fewer logistic bottlenecks. In 1914, at the start of World War I, the Germans began invading Russia. As they invaded the Russian Empire, it was able to quickly convert the larger gauge railways to the standard European size. Though it slowed down the Germans just a bit, it did not stop them from using the railways. It was easier to shorten the gauge because they only needed to move one of the rails inward. By 1916, Germany had managed to get its trains deep into Ukrainian territory, which broke the myth that the larger gauge would hamper invaders from coming into Russia. After the First World War, newly independent Poland sent a clear geopolitical signal. It ripped out all of its Russian gauge lines and converted everything to European standard gauge railways, aligning itself economically and politically with Western Europe. And that mattered when in 1920, Soviet Russia tried to invade Poland. Russian logistics stumbled. They either had to build new tracks to support their broad gauge or fall back on horses and wagons. That logistical handicap helped tilt the balance against the Soviets at the Battle of Warsaw and contributed to their retreat. In 1939, as World War II began, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland again and the Baltic countries, and annexed these areas into the USSR. As a result of annexation, Russia began to change the railways back to Russian gauge railways in Poland and in the Baltic countries. Throughout World War II, when Germany invaded Russia, a game of tug-of-war began to play out with the railways. As Germany pushed through Russia, and Russia destroyed everything as what was known as scorched earth policy, the Germans changed and repaired the railways back into standard European size gauges. This slowed the Germans down slightly, which delayed the supply lines to catching up with the front line, devastating the German army. When the Germans began retreating, to slow down the Russians, they would cut off the excess ends of the railroad ties so the Soviets could not easily shift the rails back to their own size gauges. The Soviets laid down their own new rail as they continued to drive west and towards Berlin. This gauge tug-of-war within Eastern Europe underscored how railway gauges became a territorial marker. The war ended with the Russian gauge pushed west to the heart of Europe, a sign of the coming division of the continent that left Europe divided not just by politics, but by also steel. In the aftermath of World War II, the Soviets quickly rebuilt and expanded its railways, which propelled their economic recovery and consolidated their sphere of influence. The vast majority of coal, steel, and grain was moved by train. This network binded the Soviet Union's 15 republics, which helped Moscow centralize control over resource allocation and industrial development. Eastern European countries were put in a rough spot to either convert the rail to the Russian gauge or keep the standard gauge of Europe. Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Eastern Germany ended up keeping their standard gauge, while Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania all fully transitioned to Russian gauge. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, and with that came a fragmented group of railway systems that now belonged to new countries that were cash-strapped. Logistics systems splintered as custom checkpoints rose for the first time on rail corridors, leading to border delays. Due to the lack of funds, many railways closed down. Many newly independent countries began to rethink having Russian gauge railways. However, they were unable to update the railways immediately because there was no money nor immediate incentive to do so. However, as many of the Baltic states and other post-Soviet countries began to join NATO and the EU, or were trying to connect to Western Europe, for the sake of economic trade, the Russian gauge railways became a practical problem for trade as well as a symbolic remnant of Soviet influence. In the 2010s, Ukraine began to create standard gauge railways on its eastern border, connecting Poland to logistic terminals in Lviv. Currently, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are in the works of a railway project which will connect standard gauge high-speed rail to Warsaw, in effect connecting the Baltic states to the west. This will orient their transport and trade networks, turning their backs away on Moscow and toward Western Europe, something that Russia has not been ignoring. With the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Russian gauge railways came into prominence as Russia moved into Ukraine, partially by the railways. The Russian army depended on the Ukrainian railways to move heavy equipment and supplies as they mobilized. Russia's first key objectives in Ukraine were the rail junctions in order to enable supply trains to support the Russian offensive in Donbass. The shared gauge between Ukraine and Russia meant that Russia faced no technical barriers at the border. Russia heavily relied on Ukrainian railways, and this quickly became a liability for Russia as the rail became easy and predictable targets for sabotage. Because of this, logistics of Russia's military stalled, in part because the plan was that the railways were going to do the heavy lifting in Ukraine. Belarus has allowed Russia to use its railways to infiltrate Ukraine. However, Belarusian railway workers who were sympathetic to Ukraine sabotaged tracks and signaling systems to delay the Russian train. This disrupted Russia's assault on Kiev and contributed to the logistical breakdown of the assault. Even in the age of satellites, rockets, and drones, the control of the railroad has been a pivotal piece in this war. The Ukraine war has accelerated the geopolitical shift away from Russian gauge railways. While Russia and Belarus are becoming more isolated on their Russian gauge island, neighboring EU states have scrambled to lay down kilometers of standard gauge track at key points in order to support Ukraine. Ukraine not only lacks the standard rail, but the standard gauge freight wagons in order to work with Western Europe. Ukraine has announced plans to gradually convert its major railway routes to standard gauge, but that is likely to happen in the distant future and cost billions of euros. Russia's rail is now largely cut off from Europe. The only transport that goes in and out by rail is Poland into Belarus, and even that is being heavily monitored. What began in the 1840s as an engineering choice is now in the 2020s influencing the course of a major war and the economic reordering of a region. It's a reminder that sometimes the smallest details, even just 3 inches of steel, can shape the fate of nations.